Hi everyone, I'm Chelsea. Welcome back to my studio. I'm an oil painter and I'm excited to share why and how I make what I make. So today I'd like to talk about selecting a palette and what to do when, not if, you can't match a color no matter what you try. This floral painting is ideal for this discussion because it illustrates really clearly the limitations of even the most robust palette. If you take a look at the reference I licensed for this painting, you can see a beautiful range of vivid purples that I subsequently really struggle to reproduce. Now, I'm not a color genius, but I will say that in this case, my struggle came down to the paints I was using, not my ability to mix them. Specifically, I had a really hard time capturing tints of blues and purples here without it looking really dull. By contrast, my reference has a ton of gorgeous bright tints in the equivalent places. This basically comes down to the power of my palette to mix a full range of purples and how well those pigments tint. But before I dive into how I address this problem, I want to go ahead and show you my palette as a whole. If you want to find out more about this palette, I've put together a full write-up and linked it in the description below. The write-up talks about everything from my favorite brands to how I chose these specific colors. With this palette in mind, when I started this painting, I pulled out every blue, purple, and red I had. Except anything I touched with ultramarine, cadmium red, or alizarin permanent were just too dark, and it didn't tint well. Everything looked too heavy or too dull to jump off the page. The way I ultimately solved this problem was to go and buy a totally new tube of paint that I didn't have on my palette before, called dioxazine purple. But it wasn't a perfect solution, so I want to talk about another strategy that also was a huge help here. So when you can't match a color no matter what, try to match the brilliance of the color without necessarily matching the hue. So in this painting, what I did, instead of getting a light, vibrant purple, I'd opt for a light, vibrant blue-purple, etc. This can be frustrating, but it'll force you to think strategically, and usually it'll result in a cleaner painting than if you had painted over a section over and over out of frustration. So how can you tell when it's your palette and not you? Well, for starters, if you're struggling with this often, it probably does mean that you could use more practice mixing. And as a rule of thumb, it's usually much more possible to mix a correct neutral color or desaturated color than it is to mix something really vibrant. And that's the trick here. The place your palette is going to be limited is going to be in the most vibrant tones possible for you to mix. In my experience, this tends to happen in the purples, but it could potentially be in the greens. It could be mixing a very particular bright blue, or it could come down to the ability to tint a really potent color. But no palette can give you the full spectrum of color that our eyes perceive. This, I think, really speaks to being intentional with your palette in general. Yes, I have convenience colors on my palette like King's Blue, Viridian, Yellow Ochre, but for each one, I figured out where they really make a difference and where they don't. You do not need to make a kit complete with like 50 some odd colors because sometimes you might need that perfect purple. As a rule of thumb, it's great to start with as limited a palette as you're comfortable with, and then if you run into a wall, you can squeeze out a little bit of a special color to give you the boost you need. So now that I've solved that problem, what about this painting? So this piece was a bit unusual in that I really couldn't decide when it was done. While I was working, I kept feeling like there was more to do, but when I'd look back at the time-lapse footage, I would think, why am I second-guessing myself? This is done. But when I pulled everything into my editor to make this video and saw the whole process play back, I noticed a couple things that I immediately wanted to go back and take a second look at. Both were a matter of cleaning up the background, so after I signed the piece, that's what I went back to focus on. It didn't take much, but I think it was a big help in directing the eye back to the pansies. And here's the finished piece. If you'd like to see the full-size image, I've included a link in the description below. If you enjoyed watching this time-lapse or learned something cool about palettes or pigments, be sure to like this video and subscribe to my channel. I have a bunch of new paintings in progress on my easel right now, and I'm recording all of them, so you have a lot to look forward to. And if you have any questions about oil paints or selecting your palette, be sure to comment down below because I'd love to start a conversation and make sure you're on the right track. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next week with a new painting and a new video.